Tensions between Russia and the US are higher than ever. After several months in which it seemed that President Donald Trump's administration was at least somewhat sympathetic to Russian President Vladimir Putin, the US has conducted a complete turnaround. It's thrown its support directly behind Ukraine once again, and key figures in the Pentagon are worried. One of those figures has just delivered a big message. He says that the Pentagon fears that Putin's next move could ignite a world war, forcing Russia and the US to spiral into a showdown for which the world isn't ready. On May 14th, General Gregory Guillot issued his direct warning to the Senate Armed Services Committee, who is the head of the U.S. Northern Command and North American Aerospace Defense Command, drafted a written statement to U.S. lawmakers that offered a simple warning. After 3 years of Putin's brutal war in Ukraine, Guillot says, there are now several plausible pathways that could lead to Putin's invasion escalating into a full-blown military conflict with the U.S. That's something the US has always been concerned about. The possibility of escalation has hung over Putin's full-scale invasion since it began in February 2022. We only need to look at the fear over the so-called red lines to see that. These lines, which were all actions that the US and its allies were wary about conducting for fear that Putin would escalate, were numerous when Putin invaded. Examples included Western nations sending weapons to Ukraine and those same allies allowing Ukraine to use those weapons on Russian territory. Both lines have been crossed without Putin escalating his war to cover the rest of the world. The question now is how much further can Putin be pushed? Guillot believes not much further, which is why he's issued his warning. And it gets worse. Guillot also noted that the US faces other potential threats from countries including Iran, North Korea, and China. All three could conduct actions that might embroil the US in a global war, and even more worryingly, three also have close ties to Russia. Again, it's all about pathways, Guillot claims as he notes that the probability of a direct conflict between the US and at least one of its rivals is on the rise. As Russia's brutal and misguided invasion of Ukraine enters its fourth year, there remain several plausible pathways by which the war could escalate into a direct military conflict with the United States. What are those pathways? Well, we'll answer that question in a moment. First, it's important to note that these comments represent a turnaround in the approach that the US has taken toward Russia over the last several months. For the first few months of President Trump's second term in the White House, it seemed like Trump was slowly driving the US toward Russia. That's according to The Guardian, which even provided a timeline in March to showcase the changing US attitude toward its long-term adversary. For instance, February 12th saw Trump hold a call with Putin, in which he called for the opening of negotiations that could end the Ukraine war. That call was important. It ended 3 years of Western attempts to isolate Russia's leader in response to his actions in Ukraine. The same day saw US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth rule out any possibility of Ukraine joining NATO, which seemed to send the message that the US was potentially looking to appease Putin. De-escalation seemed possible, and a budding alliance between the US and Russia appeared even more plausible a few days later when the US and Russia held talks that indicated both were interested in improving their diplomatic relationship. Those talks were followed by Trump appearing to blame Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky for starting the Ukraine war. The US president also branded Zelensky a dictator and warned that he better move fast toward peace negotiations or he won't have a country left. More moves that seemed to favor Russia followed from the US. On February 24th, the US was one of only a handful of nations to vote against a United Nations resolution condemning Putin for starting the Ukraine war. 4 days later, Trump held his explosive meeting with Zelensky at the White House that devolved into chaos and placed the relationship between the US and Ukraine on a knife edge. By early March, the US halted its military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, amidst Trump claiming that it was easier to work with Putin because he wants to end the war. At this point, it seemed tensions between Russia and the US had died down, to the point where the concept of direct conflict between the two sides was off the table. But a lot has changed since mid-March. On March 11th, delegates from Zelensky and Trump's teams met in Saudi Arabia to discuss Putin's invasion. They emerged having agreed on the terms of a total 30-day ceasefire, with the US also resuming its military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. We didn't know it at the time, but that meeting sparked a complete turnaround in the US relationship with Russia. Putin refused the ceasefire. He's refused or failed to follow through on every ceasefire proposal since, including suggestions of partial ceasefires in the Black Sea and on energy infrastructure attacks. By the end of March, Trump was telling NBC News that he was pissed off and very angry with Putin. If Russia and I are unable to make a deal on stopping the bloodshed in Ukraine, and if I think it was Russia's fault, I'm going to put secondary tariffs on all oil coming out of Russia, Trump claimed at the time. In other words, the US perspective flipped. Where Trump once seemed to be willing to work alongside Putin, he now stood against him. The tensions between the US and Russia have only heightened since then, perhaps reaching their boiling point when Ukraine and the US announced the signing of their minerals deal. That was a massive blow to Putin. That deal, the US was basically telling Russia two things: supported Ukraine and will be soon sending its own people into the country to extract Ukraine's minerals. But Putin had hoped to achieve by speaking to Trump had failed. The US once again stood firmly behind Ukraine. That leads us back to Guillot's comments about the several pathways that could lead to a direct conflict between the US and Russia, along with the key question we posed earlier: what are those pathways? Guillot only hinted at them, but one of the potential pathways to direct conflict between the US and Russia lies in Putin's consistent attempts to escalate tensions with NATO. That's nothing new. Throughout his 3-year invasion, Putin has attempted to threaten NATO with action for what he views as the group's escalation by way of its support of Ukraine. For instance, Putin warned back in September 2024 that any NATO member, including the US, allowing Ukraine to use their weapons inside Russia would be tantamount to a declaration of war. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States, and European countries are fighting Russia, Putin said at the time. The US crossed that red line and allowed Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles in Russia. Putin's promised war didn't start. Yet, more recently, Putin has shown signs that he's preparing to escalate his Ukraine invasion into a full-blown war against NATO that would drag the US into the fight. For instance, satellite images obtained by the Helsinki Times on May 10th seem to show a concerted Russian troop buildup along Russia's border with NATO. Over 130 military tents have appeared at Kamenka, which lies just 37 miles from the border, since February 2025. Storage halls and structures that appear designed to house armored vehicles have also appeared near the border, with a fourth facility also entering construction in April 2025. Make no mistake about it, Putin is preparing something big here. This military buildup threatens one of NATO's newest members, and Putin knows it. The growing tension is becoming so bad that many people expect a global war to spark by 2035. That's according to the Atlantic Council, which revealed the results of its Global Foresight 2024 survey earlier this year. According to that survey, 40% of respondents expect the Ukraine war to escalate into a multi-front conflict, with 60% of those predicting this global war also suggesting that a portion of it could be fought in space. This is the sort of scenario against which Guillot warns. Now that the US is firmly supporting Ukraine once again, Putin is making moves that suggest he's preparing for a fight against NATO. That sort of fight would force the US to respond. Despite Trump's issues with NATO, the US is still part of the Collective Defense Organization and would be duty-bound to come to any fellow member's defense if Russia invaded, per Article 5 of the NATO Charter. Imagine a scenario in which Putin's troop buildup on the Finnish border evolves into Russia invading Finland. You have your spark for global war. A NATO ally would be under threat and the US would have to enter the conflict. And now that Trump is supporting Ukraine more fervently while opposing Putin, it seems likely that the US would meet its NATO obligation. That gives us one of Guillot's several pathways to a direct conflict between Russia and the US. There are others. The growing risk of nuclear weapon use offers another potential pathway toward a direct conflict. In its Global Foresight 2024 survey, the Atlantic Council discovered that 48% of people and 63% of those who claim they were expecting World War III to start believe that nuclear weapons will be used by at least one state during the next 10 years. Of those who believe a nuclear war might start, a quarter suggested that Russia is the most likely country to use those devastating weapons by 2035. That's no surprise, we've already come closer to that outcome than anyone would like to believe. That's according to the New York Times, which wrote on March 9th that for a couple of weeks in October 2022, it seemed like Putin was on the verge of using Russia's nuclear arsenal against Ukraine. The outlet says that former President Joe Biden, while delivering what was supposed to be an optimistic talk about his plans for the US in the coming years, instead delivered a stark message. It was October 6, 2022, but what they heard instead that evening was a disturbing message that, though Mr. Biden didn't say so, seemed to reflect serious concerns from recent high-level intelligence briefings, including reports of intercepted communications. At the time, President Putin's threats to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine were being taken more seriously than ever before, even if no operational plan had been confirmed. Those nukes were potentially going to be dropped in the next few weeks. Fortunately, nothing came of this grave nuclear threat. However, it showcases how Putin seems to be teetering on the edge of pushing the big red nuclear button at any moment against Ukraine. We also can't ignore the fact that Russia's leader made important changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine in November 2024. Those changes, which followed the US crossing the red line of allowing Ukraine to use US-made long-range missiles inside Russia, amounted to Russia allowing itself to use nuclear weapons against any non-nuclear state if that state is backed by a nuclear power. The message was clear: Ukraine was the non-nuclear state. It was backed by several nuclear powers, including the US, France, and the UK. If Putin felt that Ukraine's incursions into Russia were enough of a threat, he would resort to nukes. Again, we haven't gotten to that point. However, it seems like all of the pieces have fallen into place for Russia to launch nuclear weapons if Ukraine starts experiencing any sustained success against Putin's forces. If that happens, we have another clear pathway for the US and Russia to enter direct conflict. It came close before, if the New York Times is to be believed. At some point over the next decade, that nuclear line may be crossed. Still, though so many believe that nuclear war may erupt over the next decade, this isn't the most likely pathway to a conflict between the US and Russia. Instead, the most likely route stems from Russia reinforcing its ties with three of America's major adversaries: China, North Korea, and Iran. Despite decades of mutual mistrust, Beijing and Moscow seem determined to advance their strategic partnership and military cooperation to counter what they perceive as a persistent US threat to their core security interests, Guillot wrote in his statement to the Senate. He also pointed out North Korea's willingness to dedicate military assets to Russia for the Ukraine war, as it has by delivering over 10,000 soldiers and millions of artillery shells to Putin, along with Iran's interests in the Middle East as potential catalysts for a US war with Russia. And he's not wrong. The ties between Russia and the three nations that Guillot highlights are tighter than ever. Reuters highlighted this fact in an article published at the beginning of 2025. It noted that Russia now has three defined partnerships, one for each of the nations Guillot highlights, that could potentially provide the pathway to war with the US. With China, Russia shares a strategic partnership that was first announced on February 4, 2022. It's no coincidence that this announcement came less than a month before Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine. It was almost a warning shot. Russia was partnering with China in preparation for an invasion that was only supposed to last a week. Once successful, Putin seemed to think, Russia could lean on this new alliance with China to dissuade any in the West from taking action against him for what he'd done to Ukraine. Of course, the invasion didn't work out as Putin wanted. Still, that doesn't change the nature of Russia's alliance with China, in which there are apparently no forbidden areas of cooperation. Both countries have claimed that their current relationship is superior to any formed during the Cold War. They've pledged to work together on practically every area of interest. The one saving grace, at least for the US, is that this partnership doesn't amount to a formal military alliance. There are no limits, and given that Russia and China have been holding high-profile joint military exercises over the last 3 years, it's clear that there's a growing strategic partnership forming. Still, it's a partnership that doesn't represent an immediate threat. We're unlikely to see People's Liberation Army troops storming Ukraine anytime soon. But what if China finally makes a move against Taiwan? Guillot himself said that tensions in the Taiwan Strait carry the risk of escalating into an armed conflict between China and the US, consequences that could span a generation. While he didn't outright say it, Guillot seems to be implying that Russia might come to China's aid in Taiwan, which would likely bring the US into the fight. Putin's relationship with North Korea offers a more immediate threat. On June 19, 2024, Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un announced that their countries had signed a comprehensive strategic partnership that included a mutual defense clause. We've already seen this clause in action. North Korea has sent thousands of its soldiers to aid Putin in retaking Kursk from Ukraine. Reuters says North Korea has also shipped millions of rounds of ammunition, ballistic missiles, and anti-tank rockets to Russia. North Korea isn't doing this out of the goodness of its collective heart. It expects to get something in return, namely Russian support for whatever military ambitions it harbors. What does that have to do with the US? Now that it has a mutual defense treaty with Russia, North Korea may be emboldened to finally start a conflict with South Korea. That will be a problem for the US. The 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty that the US signed with South Korea during the Korean War commits the US to coming to South Korea's aid in a conflict. South Korea is also key to the US desire to maintain a high level of influence in the Indo-Pacific. So we get another pathway toward direct conflict between the US and Russia. North Korea invades South Korea, which retaliates on North Korea's territory to bring Russia into the fight. The US would already be involved thanks to its treaty with South Korea. A global war ignites. Finally, there's Iran. In January 2025, Russia and Iran signed a new agreement designed to take their relationship to another level. Though focused primarily on economic concerns such as trade, energy, and transport, the new deal also says that Russia and Iran will work together to confront military threats and take part in joint exercises. There's no mutual defense clause, however, it's clear that Russia and Iran are now working closely on a military level. Now, what has the US been doing over the past couple of months? It's been bombing the Houthis in Yemen, who are a militant group with close ties to Iran, as Trump threatens to bomb Iran if it doesn't make a nuclear deal with the United States. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that yet another pathway to conflict between the US and Russia could result from these actions. Tensions are high in the Middle East. Russia has a vested interest in ensuring Iran's security because it wants to expand its influence in the territory. If Trump follows through on his threats against Iran, which might happen if Iran refuses to back down from developing its own nukes, Russia may decide to come to its allies' defense. But perhaps what's most worrying about these three treaties is that Russia has signed them with a trio of nations that are seemingly aligned in an anti-West agenda. Therein lies the biggest problem, Guillot seems to suggest. While he noted that Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea all seek to avoid direct conflict with the US, all four might try to capitalize on what they see as a Western decline. That could lead to a joint challenge of America's power. Such a challenge would be a miscalculation, says Guillot, but it's not impossible. While not all four members of this axis have treaties with one another, Russia has established itself as the through line and connective force between them. That's the danger. Any one of those four igniting a conflict with the United States could bring the other three into play. If that happens, there can only be one outcome: a global war with the US and Russia at its center. But what do you think about Guillot's recent comments to the Senate Armed Services Committee? Is he, along with the Pentagon, right to fear that Russia's next move, whatever it might be, has the potential to spark a global war? What would happen to the world if that war started? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest geopolitical developments. Now go and check out Putin Just Learned the Hard Way Not to Mess with the US, or click this other video instead.